I'm not trespassing. I'm exercising a family member's concern.
Some men retreat when they lose a battle. Marko Hesse was never that kind of man. He simply changed weapons. If you've ever watched someone you love face a fight they didn't choose, stay until the end. This one's for you. Before we go further, if you're new here, hit subscribe, because we tell stories like this every single week, and you do not want to miss what's coming next month. Now, let's get into it. 3 weeks had passed since the night of the fire pit, the bracelet, and the chess game that neither Niko nor Elira had finished. They'd abandoned the board halfway through, both laughing too hard at his deliberately terrible opening moves to care who won. 3 weeks of Niko's lawyers methodically dismantling every piece of legal pressure Marko had tried to apply. 3 weeks of dinners and quiet mornings and the particular fragile happiness of two people who had spent 14 years apart finally allowing themselves to imagine a future together. It should have felt like enough time to exhale. It didn't, not entirely, because Marko Hesse had spent those same 3 weeks doing something far more dangerous than direct confrontation. He had gone quiet. "I don't trust the silence," Elira said, one hand resting on the curve of her stomach as she sat across from Niko at the breakfast table in the apartment she'd reluctantly agreed to share with him for the final weeks of her pregnancy. Not out of romantic urgency, she'd insisted, but because his security made considerably more sense than her empty flat across town. Men like Marko don't disappear because they've accepted losing. They disappear because they are building something worse. Niko set down his coffee, his expression sharpening with the particular focus he brought to anything that touched her safety. "My lawyers haven't heard anything from his firm in 11 days. That's either very good news or very bad news, and I have learned never to assume it's the former." "What's your instinct telling you?" "My instinct is telling me he stopped trying to win quickly and started trying to win permanently." Niko reached across the table, his hand covering hers, the same gesture that had become as natural to both of them now as breathing. "Which means he's looking for leverage he doesn't currently have. I want you to be careful these next few weeks, Elira. More careful than you've been." She managed a tired smile. "I'm 8.5 months pregnant. I'm not exactly storming any barricades." "That's precisely my concern. You're the most vulnerable you've ever been, and Marko is the kind of man who notices vulnerability the way sharks notice blood and water." The leverage arrived 4 days later, delivered not by lawyers but by Marko himself, who appeared at Elira's final prenatal appointment with a photographer and a carefully rehearsed expression of concerned brother grief that fooled absolutely no one in the room except, apparently, the photographer he'd hired. "I have every right to be here," Marko said, when Niko's security detail moved to intercept him in the waiting room. "She's carrying my brother's child. I'm not trespassing. I'm exercising a family member's concern." "You're staging a photo opportunity," Elira said flatly, one hand instinctively moving to shield her stomach from the photographer's lens. "Get him out of here, or I will." Marko's expression shifted, the concerned brother mask sliding just enough to reveal the calculation underneath. "I'm building a record, Elira, a visual record of a pregnant widow being surrounded by armed men in a doctor's office. I think a family court judge would find that narrative compelling, don't you? Especially paired with the financial records showing exactly how much money has moved from Bill and accounts into yours over the past month." The room went very still. Niko's security detail looked to him for instruction. Niko didn't move, didn't raise his voice, simply studied Marko with an expression that had gone entirely dangerously calm. "You're proposing to use a custody argument as financial extortion," Niko said. "I want to make certain I understand the shape of what you're attempting, because I find precision useful before deciding how to respond to it. I'm proposing that you've inserted yourself into a child's life who isn't yours, surrounded that child's mother with men who carry weapons, and funneled money into her accounts in a pattern that looks, to any reasonable judge, exactly like a man attempting to purchase influence over my brother's heir." Marko's confidence had returned now that he had something concrete to brandish. "I have photographs. I have bank records. I have, frankly, an excellent case for emergency guardianship proceedings the moment this baby is born, and I intend to file the moment she takes her first breath. If you're following this story from the first part, drop a comment letting me know. I love seeing how many of you came back for this one. Now, back to the story." Elira felt something cold drop through her chest, sharper than fear, the specific helpless fury of watching someone weaponize her own child before that child had even arrived in the world. You would do that to a newborn, to score a point against a man you're afraid of. "I would do that to protect my brother's legacy from a criminal who has clearly seduced his grieving widow for reasons I don't fully trust yet," Marko said. Whatever this is between you two, Elira, I don't believe for 1 second that a man like him develops a sudden interest in a pregnant stranger out of nothing but nostalgia. Men like him don't do anything without an angle. Niko's stillness finally cracked, not into violence but into something colder and more precise. Get out, he said quietly. Before I decide that the photographer needs a more thorough conversation about consent and trespassing than my lawyers are currently planning to have with your firm. Marko left, but not before getting his photograph. A single frame snapped in the 3 seconds of chaos before security physically turned the photographer toward the door, showing Elira's startled, frightened expression beside 4 men in dark suits. It was, Niko knew immediately, exactly the kind of image that could do real damage in the hands of a competent lawyer and a sympathetic judge. The stress of it caught up with Elira's body before either of them fully registered the danger. She felt the first tightening low in her abdomen that evening, mild enough that she dismissed it as the ordinary discomfort of late pregnancy, and continued dismissing it through a second, sharper tightening an hour later, and a third that made her grip the kitchen counter hard enough that Niko crossed the room before she'd finished exhaling through it. How long have these been happening? His voice had dropped into the low, urgent register she'd come to recognize as his particular brand of controlled panic. A few hours. I thought it was stress. I thought... Another contraction cut her sentence short, tighter this time, unmistakable in a way the earlier ones hadn't been. You're in labor, Niko said. 3.5 weeks early after a day that included a stranger ambushing you with a camera in a doctor's office. I don't believe in coincidence, Elira, and I don't intend to start now. He had her in the car within minutes. His calm restored the moment action became available to him. The particular stillness of a man who managed crises for a living, redirected now toward the single crisis that mattered more than every other one combined. He called ahead to the hospital, called his head of security, called his Aunt Vesna, all while keeping one hand resting steady on Elira's knee, grounding her through each contraction with a presence that felt, to her, like the only solid thing in a night that had otherwise gone sideways without warning. Talk to me, she said, through gritted teeth somewhere around the 4th contraction. Tell me anything. I need to not be only inside my own body right now. When I was 9, my father tried to teach me to sail. Niko said immediately, his voice low and steady, anchoring. I capsized the boat twice in the same afternoon, in front of men who worked for him, men I desperately wanted to impress. He never once mentioned it again, not because he didn't notice, but because he understood that humiliating a child in front of his future employees was a worse strategic error than 2 ruined afternoons on the water. That's not comforting. That's just sad. I'm aware. I'm working with limited material. A ghost of a smile crossed his face, despite the tension in his jaw. The point, Elira, is that I have spent my entire life around men who measure strength by what they're willing to destroy. I am increasingly certain that the actual measurement is what you're willing to protect without destroying anything at all. I intend to spend the rest of tonight and every night after it, proving that to both you and our daughter. Elira's breath caught, not from the contraction this time, but from the casual, unguarded way he'd said our daughter, as though the biology of it had stopped mattering to him weeks ago and he'd simply forgotten to mention it out loud until exactly this moment. Niko, I know what I said. He didn't look away from the road, but his hand tightened slightly around hers. I meant it. I've meant it since the night I gave you back that bracelet. I am not interested in being a footnote in this child's life because of a detail of biology I had no control over. I intend to be her father, in every sense that matters, if you'll let me be. The hospital lights came into view, and Elira found herself crying, exhausted, frightened, and entirely undone by a declaration she hadn't expected in the middle of unexpected labor, in a car moving too fast through empty streets toward a night that was about to test every single thing Marko Hesse had threatened to take from both of them. The hospital staff moved Elira into a delivery room within minutes of arrival, the early labor confirmed and progressing faster than anyone had anticipated. Niko stayed exactly where she needed him, close enough to grip his hand through each contraction, far enough to let the medical team work, present in a way that surprised even him, a man who had spent 15 years being useful primarily through control and certainty, now finding himself useful through nothing more complicated than simply not leaving. You don't have to watch this part, Elira gasped, somewhere in the exhausting middle hours, when the contractions had stopped being separate events and started feeling like a single unbroken wave she was being asked to survive. I am not leaving this room, Niko said, his voice steady despite the visible strain of watching her in pain with no enemy he could neutralize, no negotiation he could win on her behalf. I have spent 14 years regretting every moment I wasn't present for the things that mattered most in your life. I am not repeating that mistake during the single most important night of it. Vesna arrived an hour later, having driven faster than was strictly legal, and took up a position in the hallway with the particular ferocity of a woman who had appointed herself unofficial guardian of this entire situation. It was Vesna who intercepted the call from Niko's lead attorney just after midnight, and Vesna who walked into the delivery room's outer area with an expression that made Niko's stomach drop before she'd said a single word. "Marko filed," she said quietly, pulling Niko aside while a nurse checked Elira's progress. "Emergency petition for guardianship pending birth," exactly like he threatened. He's citing the photograph from the doctor's office, the financial transfers, and now, somehow, I don't yet know how, he has information about tonight, about the labor starting early. He's framing it as evidence of an unstable, high-stress environment unsuitable for a newborn. He's filing while she's in active labor. He's filing specifically because she's in active labor, Niko. He's betting that you'll be too consumed with the birth to respond quickly, and that an emergency judge reviewing the petition in the next 12 hours won't have the full context before making an initial ruling. Vesna's expression was grim. "I've already called Andre. He's reviewing the petition now, but I need you to understand what we're facing. If an emergency order goes through tonight, hospital security could be legally required to prevent Elira from leaving with the baby until a custody hearing resolves the question, possibly even before she's discharged." The fury that moved through Niko in that moment was unlike anything he'd experienced in 15 years of violence and negotiation and careful, controlled retaliation, colder, more absolute, entirely without the strategic distance he usually maintained even in his most dangerous decisions. He is attempting to take my daughter from her mother's arms in a hospital room, tonight, while she is being born. "I know." Vesna gripped his arm hard. "And I need you to not become the man this situation is designed to provoke you into being. Marko wants a reaction he can point to in court. Anger, threats, anything that confirms his narrative about an unstable, dangerous environment. The single most effective thing you can do for Elira and that baby right now is exactly what you've been doing for the last 3 weeks. Let the lawyers fight this with paper, not with anything that gives him a single additional photograph to misuse. If you're new to this story, this is part 2 of a series we started a few weeks ago. Go check out the first part if you haven't, because this one will hit so much harder with that context. Now, back to the story. Niko stood in that hospital hallway and made, by every account that mattered to the rest of his life, the hardest decision he'd made in 15 years of making difficult decisions. He called Andre, gave him explicit instructions to fight Marko's petition through every legal channel available without escalation, and then walked back into the delivery room and said absolutely nothing about any of it to Elira, who had enough to carry in that single hour without adding Marko Hess's latest cruelty to the weight of it. Their daughter was born at 4:17 in the morning, 7 pounds and entirely furiously loud about her unexpected early arrival into the world. Elira held her for the first time with an expression Niko would remember for the rest of his life. Exhaustion and joy, and something fiercer underneath both, the particular ferocity of a woman discovering exactly how far she'd go to protect something that had existed, fully, for less than a minute. "She's perfect," Elira said softly, looking up at Niko with tears she'd stopped trying to control. "I keep waiting to see Dorian in her face, and instead all I can see is how lucky she is that you were in that hallway tonight instead of anyone else." Niko looked down at the small, red-faced, furious infant in Elira's arms and felt something inside him reorganize itself completely, permanently, in a way he had no language prepared for. He had built an empire out of never letting anything matter enough to be used against him. He understood in that hospital room, holding his daughter's tiny hand in his for the first time, that he had just become more vulnerable than he had been at any point since his father's car went off that coastal cliff 14 years ago, and that he would not, under any circumstances, trade that vulnerability back for the careful armor he'd worn for most of his adult life. "What do we name her?" he asked quietly. "Vera," Elira said without hesitation, as though she'd known the answer for weeks. "It means truth. I want her to grow up in a family that doesn't lie to each other, no matter how complicated the truth gets." Niko leaned down and pressed a kiss to Elira's forehead, then to the soft dark hair on his daughter's small head, and allowed himself, for one entire uninterrupted minute, to simply exist inside the happiness of the moment before he had to tell Elira what Marko had done while she was in labor. He told her an hour later, once the immediate exhaustion had eased and a nurse had taken Vera briefly for routine checks. Elira's expression hardened into something Niko hadn't fully seen from her before. Not fear, not the careful composure she'd maintained through most of Marko's previous attacks, but a focused maternal fury that made her, in that moment, look entirely capable of the violence Niko usually reserved for himself. "He filed for guardianship while I was in labor," she repeated flatly, as though saying it aloud would help her fully absorb the scope of it. "Using a photograph he staged himself, financial records that exist because you've been paying for my medical care, and the fact that I went into labor early because his ambush stressed my body into premature contractions. Yes, I want to see the petition, tonight. I want to understand exactly what he's claiming, word for word, before this goes 1 hour further without me knowing every detail of what we're fighting." Niko studied her for a long moment, something like pride moving through the exhaustion and fury he'd been holding all night. "Andre's reviewing it now. I can have it on a tablet for you within the hour, if you're certain you don't want to rest first. I just gave birth to a daughter who's already being treated as a legal battlefield before she's 12 hours old," Elira said. "I don't have the luxury of resting until I understand exactly how we're protecting her." She asked for a few minutes alone with Vera before the tablet arrived. Not to exclude Niko, she clarified gently when she saw the flicker of uncertainty cross his face, but because there was a conversation she needed to have with her daughter that belonged, for now, only to the two of them. She held Vera close to her chest in the dim hospital room, the machines beeping their quiet rhythm in the background, and spoke softly, almost too quiet for the words to qualify as speech at all. "Your father would have loved you so completely," she murmured. "He had this way of getting excited about small things. He would have shown you off to every person in his office within a week, whether they wanted to see baby pictures or not. I wish more than anything that he was here to do that. I wish you could have known exactly how gentle he was, how he never once raised his voice at me in 6 years, how safe he made ordinary days feel." Her voice caught, the grief still raw, even amid the exhaustion and joy of the last few hours. "I named you Vera because I want you to grow up knowing the truth. All of it, even the complicated parts. The truth is that your father died before he ever got to meet you, and that loss will always be part of your story, no matter how much love surrounds you now. The truth is also that you are not alone in this world, and you have people who will fight for you in ways your father never could have imagined having to." When Niko returned with the tablet 20 minutes later, he paused at the doorway, watching them for a moment before entering. Elira's face pressed gently to Vera's forehead, both of them wrapped in a stillness that felt, even from across the room, like something he shouldn't interrupt carelessly. "I don't want you to think I'm trying to replace him," he said quietly, once he'd crossed the room and settled into the chair beside her bed. "Whatever role I end up playing in her life, whatever the courts decide, whatever Marko throws at us, I wanted to exist alongside Dorian's memory, not instead of it. She should grow up knowing both truths, that her father loved her before he ever met her, and that I chose to love her too, the moment I understood what loving you actually required of me." Elira looked at him for a long moment, something soft and grateful moving across her exhausted face. "That's exactly the right thing to say, and I suspect you know it." "I'm learning," Niko said, slowly, "about which truths matter more than the version of strength I was raised on." He reached out and gently brushed his knuckle against Vera's small cheek, the gesture careful in a way that looked almost foreign on hands capable of so much else. "I read the petition while you were resting. I think you should see it before the lawyers walk us through it formally. I think you deserve to read Marko's own words in his own framing, rather than hearing them filtered through Andre's analysis first." She nodded, steadying herself, and took the tablet from his hands. The emergency hearing was scheduled for 2 days later, a timeline Andre had fought hard to delay further and lost. "Family court judges," he explained grimly, moved quickly on emergency petitions specifically because they involved newborns, and the very urgency Marko had engineered was now working in his favor procedurally, regardless of how thin his underlying case actually was. "He doesn't need to win," Andre explained, sitting across from Niko and Elira in the small hospital room 2 days after Vera's birth, papers spread across the rolling table usually reserved for meal trays. "He needs to create enough doubt that the judge orders a temporary evaluation period, supervised visitation, a court-appointed guardian ad litem, anything that keeps this case alive long enough for him to keep pressuring you both publicly. That's the actual strategy here. Delay and exposure, not victory." "Then we don't give him exposure," Elira said, looking down at Vera asleep in her arms, the fierce maternal focus from 2 nights earlier still steady in her voice. "We don't give him a single photograph, a single soundbite, a single piece of footage that fits the narrative he's building. We go into that courtroom and we are unbearably, exhaustingly boring. We are the most stable, well-documented, financially transparent two people that judge has ever seen. Andre looked faintly impressed despite the gravity of the situation. That's actually exactly the right instinct. Judges don't grant emergency guardianship petitions against parents who present as stable and cooperative. Marko's entire case depends on making you both look unpredictable or dangerous. If you walk in there calm, prepared, and entirely unremarkable, his petition starts looking like exactly what it is: a grieving brother's grasp for control, dressed up in legal language. Niko, who had spent the better part of 2 days fighting the urge to handle Marko Hesse in a manner considerably more permanent than a courtroom appearance, found himself studying Elira with something that had started to feel increasingly like awe. "You're better at this than either of us," he said, Andre included. "I spent 6 years married into a family that taught me exactly how performance and perception work in rooms full of powerful men," Elira said. "I just never had a reason to use it on my own behalf before. I have an excellent reason now." If you've ever had to fight for something you loved in a system that wasn't built to make it easy, let us know in the comments. Your stories are honestly half the reason we keep telling these. Now, back to the story. The courtroom, when the hearing finally arrived, was smaller and less dramatic than either of them had braced for. A cramped municipal room with fluorescent lighting that did nothing flattering for anyone present. A tired-looking judge who had clearly reviewed several dozen emergency petitions that month alone, and Marko seated beside his lawyer in an expensive suit that read, in this particular room, as slightly desperate rather than authoritative. Elira sat with Vera held close against her chest, dressed simply, answering every question from the judge with calm, measured honesty that left almost nothing for Marko's lawyer to twist into anything resembling instability. Yes, she had received financial support from Niko Bilen. No, it had not come with conditions attached. Yes, she understood the nature of his business interests. No, she had never witnessed him behave in any way that suggested danger to herself or her child. Quite the opposite, she stated plainly, looking directly at the judge rather than at Marko. He had spent the last several weeks demonstrating restraint under provocation that would have tested any reasonable person's patience. Niko's testimony, when it came, was deliberately, carefully unremarkable. Financial records laid bare without hesitation. His relationship with Elira described in plain, unembellished terms. His answer to the judge's pointed question about the nature of his business interests, handled with a directness that surprised even Andre. "I won't pretend my work exists outside legal gray areas the court would find comfortable, Your Honor. I will say that nothing in 15 years of running that business has ever touched Elira or Vera, and I intend for that to remain true for the rest of both their lives, regardless of what biology says about my role in this family." Marko's lawyer, a sharp-featured man named Cruz, who had clearly built a career on exploiting exactly this kind of emotionally charged family dispute, pressed harder during cross-examination than Andre had warned them to expect. "Ms. Ionescu," Cruz said, pacing slowly in front of the witness stand with the practiced rhythm of a man who enjoyed being watched, "you've testified that Mr. Bielen's business interests have never touched you or your daughter, yet you've also testified that you require a security detail. Can you explain to the court how those two statements coexist without contradiction?" Elira didn't flinch. "A security detail exists because threats were made against me directly, by men acting on behalf of a rival business dispute, 3 weeks before my daughter was born. The detail exists to prevent danger, not because danger has already arrived inside our home. I would think a court interested in protecting children would view proactive protection as evidence of responsible parenting, not instability." "Convenient framing?" Cruz said. "Isn't it true that the very existence of threats against you proves exactly the unstable environment my client is concerned about?" "It's true that the world Niko exists in carries real danger," Elira said evenly. "It is also true that every choice he has made since I came back into his life has been oriented around minimizing that danger to my daughter and me, sometimes at real cost to himself, including, I might add, the loss of 2 of his own men who disagreed with his choice to handle a serious business conflict without violence, specifically because I asked him to. I would invite the court to consider which is more relevant to Vera's welfare, the danger that exists in the world around us, or the consistent demonstrated pattern of how the man in this room responds to it." Cruz shifted tactics, turning toward Niko's earlier testimony about the financial transfers. "Mr. Bielen, you've described these payments as unconditional support, yet you also testified just moments ago that you intend to be a father figure to this child. Isn't it possible, likely even, that the financial support was never unconditional at all, but rather the opening terms of an arrangement you expected eventual parental rights in exchange for? Niko's expression remained level, though Elira could see the effort it cost him to keep his voice as measured as it came out. I would invite you to examine the timeline more carefully, Counsel. The financial support began the week of Elira's grandmother's funeral, before either of us had discussed anything resembling a relationship, let alone a future involving her daughter. I paid for medical care and security because a person I have known since I was 16 years old needed both, and I had the means to provide them. Any expectation of a relationship with Vera developed considerably later, was never communicated as a condition, and remains to this day something I am asking for rather than assuming I am entitled to. The judge, who had been largely silent through the exchange, finally interjected with the particular weariness of someone who had heard a great many strained arguments in that courtroom. Counsel, I'm going to ask you to move towards something resembling actual evidence of risk to the child, rather than continuing to construct hypothetical motives for financial generosity. This court has limited patience for speculation dressed up as cross-examination. It was the opening Andre had been waiting for, and Vesna's testimony followed immediately after, calm and devastating in its specificity. Calm, grandmotherly, utterly credible, in a way that made Marko's increasingly strained objections look exactly like what they were. She described in plain detail the photograph Marko had staged at the prenatal appointment, the financial records he'd obtained through means his own lawyer couldn't fully account for under questioning, and the timing of his emergency filing relative to Elira's labor, a timeline that laid out clearly in a courtroom rather than buried in legal filings, made the manipulation behind it impossible to ignore. The judge denied Marko's emergency petition within the hour, citing insufficient evidence of risk to the child and explicitly noting, in language that made Andre visibly relax for the first time all morning, a pattern of conduct on the petitioner's part that the court found concerning rather than protective. Marko left the courtroom without making eye contact with anyone, his expensive suit suddenly looking considerably smaller on him than it had that morning. They didn't celebrate that night, not in any traditional sense. They went home, Niko's apartment, which had quietly, unofficially become their apartment over the past 3 weeks, and sat together on the couch with Vera asleep between them, exhausted in the particular way that follows the release of fear you'd been carrying so long, you'd forgotten what your body felt like without it. He's not finished, Elira said quietly, watching their daughter breathe in the easy, unbothered rhythm of an infant who had no idea what her first week of existence had already required of the people protecting her. Men like Marko don't stop because they lost once. He'll find another angle. I know, Niko said. I'm not going to pretend otherwise to make tonight feel more resolved than it actually is. He reached over and gently adjusted the blanket around Vera's small shoulders, the gesture so careful it looked almost foreign on a man capable of the things Niko was capable of. But I think we just proved something important tonight, Elira. Not to Marko, to ourselves. We proved that the version of this family I want to build, the one built on transparency instead of intimidation, on restraint instead of retaliation, actually works, even under real pressure, even when the stakes were as high as they've ever been. It cost us 2 sleepless nights in a hospital room full of legal paperwork instead of flowers. Every meaningful thing costs something, Niko said. I learned that 14 years too late the first time, and I have no intention of forgetting it now that I finally understand what's actually worth the cost. He looked down at Vera, then at Elira, with an expression that held none of the careful control he brought to the rest of his life. I keep thinking about the doc, about the version of myself that handed you a bracelet at 16 and then spent 14 years too afraid to act on anything that mattered. I am not that version of myself anymore, and I don't intend to ever be him again. Not for Marko, not for the business, not for anyone who tries to convince me that loving the two of you, fully, is a liability rather than the only thing I've ever done correctly. Elira leaned into him, her head against his shoulder, watching their daughter sleep in the quiet, hard-won peace of a night that had asked everything of both of them and somehow, despite every obstacle Marko had engineered, left them with exactly what mattered most still intact. 14 years, she murmured, in one bracelet. And now her. And now her, Niko agreed softly. I don't know what Marko does next. I don't know what any of this costs us in the months ahead, but I know that whatever it is, I'm no longer facing it as someone who learned to survive alone. I'm facing it as her father, and as the man who finally, after everything, gets to call you mine without flinching at what that word might cost either of us. It wasn't a clean ending, Danger like Marko's didn't resolve in a single courtroom victory, and both of them understood that better than most. But it was, for one quiet night in an apartment that smelled faintly of hospital and new beginnings, exactly enough. A daughter named for truth, a man finally living without the armor he'd worn for 14 years, and a woman who had learned the hard way that love built on honesty could survive even the worst that someone else's cruelty had to offer. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments and subscribe if you haven't yet. There's more of Niko and Elira's story coming, because Marko Hesse is not the kind of man who simply walks away. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.